Hi, I'm Michael Bleby from the Australian Financial Review. You've heard all of our speakers bar one so far this morning. Philip Ross, Harald Becker, Tony Armstrong, and the person that hasn't spoken yet is David Rolls from Mirvac. I think, Tony, you've opened yourself up to the first question. Old hat, crap, and a fad. You talk about the state of the conversation in workplace culture in Australia. Whose fault is it that we're seeing such a kickback against ABW? Why are we seeing a kickback?
It's originally when activity-based working was brought in here, there was such fear of it. Like, you know, when companies wanted to embrace it, but they were kind of jumping at shadows. And I remember being involved in some of the first announcements about companies wanting to do activity-based working, and the kind of conversations we had out the back, like, don't say this, don't say that, oh, be careful how you mention that, and how you kind of put the whole thing forward. But those companies had to really throw a lot of money at it to be able to develop the kind of space that just took all of the angst out of it. Some of the pilot spaces that were built were such that when people walked into there, going, oh, you know, this isn't going to work, they just walked in and went, wow, okay, this, yeah, maybe. And so those kind of companies really kind of threw money at it until it worked. It's got to the point now where that fear of activity-based working is gone. People don't fear it. And I think that's really, really dangerous because now companies can pretty much get away with anything and build any old crap workplace and then wonder why it doesn't work. But whenever I've been working with companies around activity-based working and the kind of the change aspects, I've always encouraged and said, please challenge. If you don't like something, tell us about it and we'll try to see what we can do. And if you don't like the answer, keep challenging us, because every one of the projects that I've worked on has been better because of the challenges and pushback, and ultimately, you know, it's not a fun process, but eventually you get to a good result. The pushback's kind of gone a bit now. People would just take anything.
Yeah. David, as a landlord, what do you think is lacking in the conversation? Is it simply the fact that talk about ABW, agile work, flexible work, whatever, it's simply turned into a shorthand for a conversation about a real estate play?
I think that when activity-based working or activity-based collaboration is done properly, it's actually planned much more deeply, and it suits each organisation, because it may not suit an organisation. So you've got to make sure you spend a lot of time talking to everybody in that business to understand how it works, how they network, how the jelly beans work. Those all are very important to working out how you actually then design the workplace. Whereas if you try and overlay, the term you used was fake ABW, then it's just simply not going to work. I think people will see through that very quickly.
Philip, how's the conversation in a global context? Mm-hmm. You referred to, you showed us a picture of Macquarie's London headquarters, but elsewhere, what's the state of conversation, particularly in Europe and potentially the US, and how does it compare with what you see and hear here?
I think every corporate has on its agenda the future or the new world of work. So everyone understands that things will change, and these are shifts that Harald mentioned and so on. I think they are interpreting it in a less formulaic way. I think that what I'm seeing in this market is that, you know, there was an early adoption. People like Macquarie and Shelley Street came to Europe. They saw what was one of my favourite projects still, Interpolis in the southern Netherlands, a place called Tilburg, a big insurance division that went to activity-based working in 1995, would you believe, so 20 years ago. And that was a very different interpretation of what I'm seeing here in this market. I mean, that was a space that was designed by artists and was about people, and it gave a richness and a choice and a variety. The danger is that you translate that into a space-saving ratio, kind of quite vanilla solution. It is not much different to a hot desking type of environment. So the most rich environments I'm seeing globally are ones which are designed with an aesthetic that's very different, like the second home I showed, which is a hacked carpet warehouse, designed by some very eclectic Spanish architects, with one of the best restaurants in London, providing the workers food for a lunch of £5, and all the tech companies want to be there. So I think I'm seeing variety and choice, and not this kind of formulaic approach to what is being termed ABW that's a bit kind of limiting.
If it's a deep understanding, how widespread is it though? Is it in the popular consciousness in the way that a term like ABW is in Australia?
Yeah, I think almost every organisation's got a pilot or a trial somewhere in the world of a new way of working. And they're called all sorts of different things, from smart work to agile work and so on. But people realise that work is different, and I think very few do it properly. And to do it properly, it's this overlay of technology, place and people, and a collision. And when you get that right, it's a very exciting future.
Turning to technology, Harald, I did think it was kind of ironic in the presentation you showed that in one of the scenes up came the phrase rewind. And I just thought in this era you're describing, to talk about sort of rewinding, which is sort of a term that dates back to tapes, is, well, cute, perhaps.
We
Perhaps
try
more
to be
relevant.
cute every now and then.
Sorry?
We try to be cute every now and then.
I guess perhaps a fairly basic question to ask is, what's the cost of the new technology that you're describing? And how will customers, particularly corporate landlords, the people who have to make these investment decisions, how can they know now what's going to work of the sort of the panoply of technologies laid out in front of them? How do they know what's going to work and endure and is worth spending money on?
Yeah. Let me quickly go back to the rewind comment. Rewinding is interesting in that increasingly we author content together, and we don't think about that process as static documents anymore, where you have certain versions, but it's a very fluid process, organic process, and sometimes you want to be able to rewind and see, where stuff came from. So we think it's, instead of having a save button, having a rewind button is actually really interesting in that process. But back to your question, I like to think about it a little bit differently than what does this technology cost? What is that tool, this environment cost companies? And turn it around into, I think Tony talked about ROI. How can the environment be seen as a platform for collaboration and communication that ultimately is a leverage point for business? And luckily, we now have some companies, and I'm excited to hear Jeremy speak this afternoon, that use some emerging tech to put some hard numbers, some metrics on the sometimes very abstract language that we use when we describe the future of work. So Sociometric Solutions has a sensor-loaded badge that allows them to visualize how people actually communicate and collaborate in the built environment. And Jeremy may talk about some of those case studies where companies without any technology deployment achieved 20+% productivity gains just by focusing on how people work, when they can share ideas, tap into tacit knowledge. So I'm sorry I don't have a dollar number for you what the technology costs, but I think if we shift our mindset and we look at some of these things as enabling people to do their best work, I do believe companies will see a very strong ROI.
How do they respond? Have you spoken to how do people respond when you have that conversation? Do they get it?
I think we see a spectrum of responses. My sense is that Australia is leading the charge and people are a lot more open-minded about it. I talk to a lot of executives in Redmond in the United States that need a lot of education on this front. They have a very old mental model of what the real estate means to their organization, and I don't think they see this strategic value. But there's an awakening happening for sure, and I think there are certain companies leading the way, and it gets down to talent and people having, a certain class of people having the choice to say, that's the environment I want to work for.
David, as the landlord on the panel, I'm afraid I need to come back to you with this one. How implementable is all this stuff in reality? We saw in Philip's presentation the plans for the new Google headquarters in Silicon Valley. unveiled last week. You know, does what we see Google planning in Silicon Valley sort of bear as much resemblance to landlords and building stock in Australia as, say, what you see on a Paris fashion catwalk has to do with what you see on the ground floor of a Myers department store? You know, is it sort of, are we talking different levels here, that you've got the ideal and what we would like to, what we'd like to aspire to, and the reality that we all have to deal with?
Now, it's an interesting angle on that one. I think over time we all mimic and take away and learn things from flagship projects, and there's always a number of flagship projects that lead the charge as far as what we all aspire to create in our own context. And it's not quite the same in Silicon Valley with a Google-wrapped thing versus what we do in our cities. But some of the things that they're doing there, we can take away from that and actually apply them to a normal building in a normal context. And everyone will take something different away from what the leader of the space is doing. And I think that's very healthy. And I think in Australia, we're very privileged to have a whole bunch of leading flagship projects that have been developed over the last 15 or 20 years. And I think most of the people in this audience would know what they are. And we're all taking parts of those buildings to apply them to the next building. And I think in that sense, we're very advanced in what we're doing.
Well, it's interesting, just to add to that, because I think what David at Google said was really fascinating, that, you know, the tech companies over the last 20 years have grown up and have had to compromise and exist in the current boxes that were available in Silicon Valley. Yeah, so, you know, Facebook had to exist in Sun's old campus and adapt it as best they can. But what David said is we're now grown up enough to build our own buildings and start again. So maybe we're going to go through a new era, because LinkedIn and they're all putting their planning applications in. Apple's building its famous building, and maybe we're going to see a new era where there's no constraints and no assumptions, and that will have a huge impact on property potentially if we start again.
It will. The issue with our cities, and we're finding even the tech companies coming back to our cities in droves. San Francisco's finding that as well, and that 80% or over 80% of our buildings in our cities are over 20 or 25 years old. So what is that impact going to have on the nature of the workplace that you need to create with this old fabric that we have, and then apply a wellness index over the top of that? It's a really interesting time that we're in, and I don't think we all have the answers.
Philip, you talked about the quantified self and the idea that people will be able to be measured in a range of metrics that they haven't been up until now. Isn't the risk of that it just turns back into the old nightmare of the boss standing up on the deck watching the cubicles? And aren't we at risk in this new world that you describe of turning into another box-ticking exercise, but just measured not by sitting in a cubicle, but sending emails, making phone calls, doing whatever?
I mean, that will be the downside. I mean, and I think that's a danger in society with the privacy issues of mobile technology, which we're well aware of. I think you have to always look at the positives and the upside, and that has to much more play around wellness or well-being. So, you know, for example, we sit down for far too long at work. You know, we're sedentary for 11 hours a day on average, and globally that's causing issues with obesity and diabetes and a range of things. So to be told or to be prompted, look, time to stand up, time to walk, how many steps have you taken today, are good things for a wellness vision. But I think it goes back to what Harald said, you know, the idea that you can actually, through wearable technology quite soon, measure your physiognomy and say, look, you're about to do some great work in a state of flow. I'm going to block all your communications. I'll just stop everything for 20 minutes or half an hour, so that the quantified self allows you to get better work done, basically, and do more productive work, which in theory should be great.
And I would add to that, it's critical that folks have control over their data, and that it's not, you know, something that's managed by the man, because otherwise, you're exactly right. We could go into some very dark territory quickly.
Well, we could. So then, Tony, what's the challenge then for employers to change the way that they think and assess staff? You know, what does it require? How does the new breed of boss need to evolve to assess and analyse and value staff?
I think one of the really important characteristics of leaders moving forward is the emotional intelligence, that kind of inspiration in a person that has the ability to really bind teams together and to get that sense of trust where you don't really mind if they know exactly what you're doing, because there's the trust there within the team that you're delivering and that you know that you're meeting expectations or not meeting expectations. But I think that's going to be in short supply. It's not something that's that's really that prevalent in leadership, but it's something that in the future will be really important. And that's as we move towards sort of smaller teams of maybe 4 to 6 people in a kind of a high performance scenario. Everyone will be quite happy for each other to know what they're doing as long as they are contributing. If you're not contributing, well, you will be found out, and I guess that's probably for the best.
I guess we've seen a taste of that recently. I read on the weekend that ANZ CEO Mike Smith has announced that all of his bank's 30,000 odd staff should be able to work flexibly if they want. Now, if you're going to sort of allow 30,000 people across a bank to work flexibly, that presumably means you as a boss are going to say, all right, I don't expect you to, I'm not going to performance manage you based on the number of hours you're sitting at in the Docklands headquarters. How that seems to be a change coming from the top rather than, say, from the property division of the bank, saying we need people to, we want to change things. How important is it for these decisions now to come from the top? And are we seeing enough organisations that have a top executive willing to take those risks and let their staff go in that sense? That's a question for everyone.
You as a journalist, how do you see yourself working in that environment? You'd rather probably be measured by the articles you write and what you produce rather than how many hours you spend at your desk.
Absolutely. I do think it's kind of ironic that I have to run out after this and get back to the office because we've got a new IT system that means that our print deadlines have come forward a whole lot earlier. But so, the technology doesn't always, doesn't quite do what we need to all the time. But, it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Probably not Microsoft, I guess.
Afraid not.
I think it's a great. That's where, in a sense, where this idea of the jelly bean came from. I think with distributed work, I heard so many people saying we don't trust people. Are they working? Shirking from home became the new name for working from home in Europe, and the idea that the jelly bean is kind of changing based on what you're doing and your current status means it doesn't matter where you are. It's the death of distance. It's invisible, and we're seeing people trust because it's an output-led view of the world. It's results-orientated, and that's the vision, that you can achieve that. I think people then get liberated because they can have the ability to choose themselves what suits them best.
And that's why the small team is really important as well, because within a small team of 4 to 6, it's pretty obvious if someone's not pulling their weight. And there is that, as long as everyone is, then there's that real sense of trust, and you can kind of work as a family in a way, and there's give and take, and you know that someone has to finish at 3 and pick up the kids, and they won't be online after that time. But when you've got that small group of people who all know each other and are in tune with how they're working, that's when you get the level of trust and the level of buy-in and the level of passion to be actually able to achieve the high performance work, as opposed to if you're being judged by someone from a distance who doesn't really know you, doesn't really know what you've been doing to contribute to the organisation.
Yeah.
Just to create some controversy on the panel, I actually do believe it's critical to have top-down support for this kind of culture. And if you don't, I don't see how it's happening organically. If there's an old reward system in place, if it's not supported by the leadership, I don't think it's going to happen.
On that score, what sort of changing skills does the technology require us to have? This isn't just a technology game anymore. This is a behavioural game. So, Harold, what skills then are going to be necessary on the part of managers and leaders to use and exploit these technologies to the fullest? Because this isn't just a matter for IT geeks now, is it?
No, I hope not. That would be a scary future. I really like Tony's answer. I mean, I think it's the new skills for leadership that matter in the future from our perspective are all about empathy, trust, collaboration, emotional IQ. I guess it's multi-stakeholder management is the understanding that the old chain of command is gone for the most part. And I need to be able to give control to the people who really know their jobs. And I need to trust them and respect them to do their job. And I think if that is manifested in the culture, you have a pretty good chance to have a high-performance work environment.
I think what I'm also seeing is that buildings can drive performance, culture, behaviour, can't they? So I think it's one thing a management top-down saying we're going to change the way we work and change our culture. I think I'm seeing people using real estate to change people's physical behaviours. And that's an interesting ingredient and a new level that should be evolved, I think.
Give us an example of that.
Well, I mean, there was a famous quote after the Second World War by Churchill when the Parliament building was bombed. He said, "We shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us." And I think you hear a lot of leaderships who get it, then begin to use a relocation, for example, as a trigger for a new corporate culture. And it's very difficult to say, hey, it's Monday morning, we're going to change our culture, and here's the memo. But if you move people to a physical environment that changes your behaviours, changes the kind of co-location and the juxtaposition, encourages the bumps and a whole range of things, that's how culture changes.
A good example of that, the old bastion of perimeter offices are law firms. And we found at 8 Chifley in Sydney that cores went into workstations and have no offices at all. They've got their premises over a number of floors with 3-floor cutouts where everybody can see everybody else. And their productivity, and they talk about it openly, has gone through the roof. And their ability to attract graduates has gone through the roof. So that old world, I think, is slowly changing. Even lawyers are now taking it on board.
Well, if the lawyers are, then none of us, the rest of us, don't have any excuses. David, in terms of co-work, how much, Tony was talking about some of the things that landlords are doing to turn over space to co-working. How much are you testing the waters with practicing with testing co-working tenancies and changing over your model of traditional leasing out of space to this sort of new paradigm?
Yeah, we're looking at those models and how you might interplay those. The example you used about a tenant taking an extra floor is really important. And just listening to that discussion, I actually think WeWork is probably the property version of Uber.
Yeah.
In that context. And we've got to be very careful as owners and creators of buildings that we're not taken over by the Uber of property. So we have to adopt different models for dealing with companies that need much more flexibility. And the old tenant-landlord hierarchy is hundreds of years old. And that's changing. So, what is going to happen in the buildings that we're putting together in the next 5 to 10 years, and the technology uptake of the next 5 years is scary. And a property cycle for those people here, from the time you buy a building to when you finish it is at least 5 years. So what does that building look like at the end, and what's the structure of your leases? And it's actually a brave new world that we're about to enter.
Sorry to interrupt. I actually think that it's important to also understand that, it seems in a lot of ways that the tenant's getting more flexibility and the landlord's giving. I don't necessarily see it as the landlord having to suffer or to take a haircut on their revenue in any way. In my experience from working with corporations, when they're looking to do their long-term lease for the next 12 years, they're looking to get, the right amount of space for the least amount of money possible. So, and obviously moving forward to the future, they'll probably try to get smaller spaces and build all of these flexibility things in, and what does that actually mean for the landlord? But there's actually an opportunity for the landlord as well, because also in my experience in companies that whenever a project comes out of left field, out of nowhere, the company's ready, as long as they've got the business case saying we've got this opportunity in the next 6 months, we can make this much money from it, they're ready to throw money hand over fist at it to get that opportunity. Yes, here's a pile of money, get the talent. Here's a pile of money, get me the space. So really, I don't think, even though tenants are always looking to spend the least possible, what is most valuable to a tenant is to be able to spend the money when the justification's there. So obviously have your nice baseline for the space that you need for your long-term lease, but when these opportunities come up and they need great space at short notice, that they're willing to pay over the odds as long as they've got the business case that says, get me the space or we're going to miss this opportunity.
Right. Got one last question to ask each of you, but I just had to ask David about the point about WeWork being the Uber of office space. I noticed WeWork's. I assume it's an American thing, right? Notice you didn't happen to say it was liquid space, which is the equivalent of a it's being done by GPT here, well, it's sort of invested in by them. It's not just, we shouldn't get sort of hung up on one particular product like, Uber or WeWork or whatever. What you're saying is this is a phenomenon that's coming, and it doesn't really matter who provides it.
Yeah, it's here to stay, and I think it's a good thing. I don't think it's a scary thing at all. I think the ability to have space that's made available for people who want to work differently is positive for particularly existing assets that need to get a new life, and being able to, the space you talked about, Philip, put in Silicon Roundabout, the old carpet factory is now being converted. It's the centre of, there's a whole new life for these assets, even though they're going to have to rethink themselves, but under a different model.
All right. Final question for the three of you, not for you, Philip, because it doesn't really apply to you, I don't think. But Tony, David and Harald, just in one word, do you reckon your industry now is easier to work in or harder to work in than it was when you first started in it? Tony? Has the world of work become easier for you or harder for you?
Neither. No, it's just the same.
Much easier, I think. I think the tools that we have to do what we do are much more at hand, and you can get things done much quicker.
A lot easier.
All right. And with that,
Thank you very much.
thank you.
Thank you.